I want to welcome everybody to this city, Cape Town, to Africa. Many call it Africa. We call it home. We need oil and gas in Africa. We need fossil fuels. We need coal. And we would bring in renewables. Africa, this continent that contributes 3% greenhouse gas emission, cannot be the continent that becomes the climate criminals. To stand in this hall and tell Africans that you can't use your natural gas when somebody is asking for natural gas in Europe. Somebody is asking for natural gas in many countries that want to develop. How dare you tell everybody in this continent you have no right to use the natural gas to power Africa? That is not acceptable. Our continent, with 600 million without access to electricity, 900 million without clean cooking technologies. I would take no lectures from anybody that has electricity, that grows up every day, even though they eat their almond milk and drink their soy latte, to tell us that we cannot have energy in this Africa. It's unacceptable. Climate justice. Of course we need climate justice. Where is the $100 billion that they promise us every year? Climate justice. Let's talk about that. When you talk about climate justice, maybe we look at the young man in Mozambique that is going every day without electricity and no jobs. Climate justice. Maybe we look at those young people in Namibia or those young people in Uganda or 90 million in the north of Nigeria that have no electricity, and they dare to say promises made, promises broken. This industry is that industry that's going to lift them up, because energy, oil and gas promises made, FIDs made, they are kept. And you should be proud of this industry. I stand here as a son of Africa. And we have to set motions and find solutions to make that happen. That's why it was so important. We were proud to have Afreximbank and African Petroleum Producers Organization. They got out there and they said, we have an issue where there's a chokehold on financing. A few years ago, they said, oil, natural gas is not green energy. Then something happened, and so few people in Europe said natural gas was green energy. And you know what? We got choked out and cut out of financing. If you're an independent, an operator, what happens? The exclusionary rule in Europe that says natural gas is green in Europe and can be funded, but it's not green in Africa. That is not right. You cannot hold Africa back from its possibilities to get financing for gas development, where you find the poorest of the poor. Think about our food security, that we can be able to provide food through fertilizer. Isn't it something that our continent is today being tagged as the climate criminals when we have to beg for food from Ukraine, a country at war? That is not right. That's why we need natural gas. That's why we have to drive up gas development in this continent, and we should not be apologetic about it. Our continent, and we thank you, Dr. Farouk, for really working together with Professor Arama, with Afreximbank, to get Africa Energy Bank together. Let's keep moving, and we thank you so much for doing that.
In my recognitions, I distinguish between APO ministers and potential ministers. This is to say that our doors are open to receiving as many African countries as possible into our organization, including those who have made finds but have not yet started producing, and those who are yet to make finds. For those who are yet to make finds, we want you on board because our vision is changing. In the past, APA, the precursor to APO, simply focused on cooperation and collaboration in the field of oil and gas among its member countries. The cooperation and collaboration were to facilitate enhanced oil and gas production, primarily for export outside of Africa. Today, the challenges facing oil and gas producing countries in Africa goes beyond oil and gas production for export. A major study conducted by APO a couple of years ago on the future of the oil and gas industry in the light of energy transition identified three imminent challenges. These are the challenge of financing oil and gas projects, the challenge of oil and gas technology and expertise, which the continent lacks, and the challenge of creating alternative markets for our oil and gas, as those on whom we have depended for markets for our oil and gas continue their efforts to wean themselves from oil and gas in the name of energy transition. Ladies, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, the history of oil and gas production in Africa has been one of heavy dependence. Some will call it interdependence, but I call it dependence, or at best, unequal interdependence. We have been heavily dependent on outside Africa for project financing, for technology of the industry, and for markets for our oil and gas. But those on whom we have been solely dependent were never solely dependent on us for either their gas or their oil. Africa cannot continue lamenting its mistakes. It's time to look forward and take on common actions to right the wrongs of the past. In doing so, we have to accept that our salvation as a people lies within us, not from anyone or any country outside our continent. It does not lie in receiving aids in any form. It lies in our ability to get out of our minds the ingrained belief that we, Africans, cannot make it without assistance from today's developed world. In APO, we are already in this mindset, and that explains the actions we have taken in the last couple of years to address the imminent challenges that the energy transition poses to the oil and gas industry on our continent. The decision of the APO Ministerial Council to partner with Afreximbank to establish the Africa Energy Bank is one such action, bold, independent, and Africa-centered. Please join me in recognizing the members of the APO Ministerial Council here present for their very bold decisions. Ministers Azevedo, Badawi, Oburu, Ichua, Abeke, Khalifa, Alwindo, Sekombi, Lokobiri, Mantashe, and in particular, let us recognize two gentlemen whose role in this game-changing project cannot be overemphasized. Please let us recognize His Excellency, Dr. Diamantino Pedro Azevedo, Minister of Petroleum and Mineral Resources of APO founder member country, the Republic of Angola, and APO President for 2022. And His Excellency, Professor Benedict Oke Orama, President and Chairman of the Board of Afrexim. When in the first half of 2022, I met Professor Orama for the first time to discuss the Africa Energy Bank. After some months of discussion between our two teams, I left that meeting with a very high impression of this Pan-Africanist. Orama left me in no doubt that he was committed to the struggle to end energy poverty in Africa. I immediately put a call to Dr. Azevedo, the president of APO, to say that I needed to come see him on my meeting with Professor Orama. He gave me the go-ahead, and off to Luanda I flew. I briefed the president, and he was as excited as I was. I mentioned that we needed Ministerial Council approval before we could proceed further with any negotiations with Afreximbank. The president immediately gave me anticipatory approval, saying that he would call for an extraordinary Ministerial Council session to consider and ratify his approval. That was how, within a few weeks, APO ministers gathered in Luanda under the high patronage of President João Lourenço to mandate us to sign an MOU on the establishment of the Africa Energy Bank. Still on the new mindset and the actions APO has taken to address the other challenges of the energy transition, we created the Forum of CEOs APO NOCs the Forum of Directors of Oil and Gas Research, Development and Innovation, and the Forum of Upper Member Countries Oil and Gas Training Institutions. Our ultimate objective is to have regional centers of excellence in the various sectors of the oil and gas industry. This is because we have come to the recognition that it does not make sense for each of our member countries to aim to be centers of excellence in the various sectors of the industry. Individually, none of our countries has all it takes to successfully address all the three challenges that we face. But pooling our resources together, we have all it takes to do so. The first regional centers of excellence can be replicated with time. On energy markets, it's important to understand the provision of energy infrastructure is a major prerequisite for the development of energy markets, whether at national, regional, or continental level. Sadly for Africa, for the nearly 100 years that we have been producing oil and gas, our focus has been to produce oil and gas for export. Hence, we never developed national, regional, or continental energy infrastructure, which would have created homegrown market for our energy. Instead, we were made to erroneously believe that our people are too poor to buy energy. So we produce energy for those who can afford it, while we abandon our own people to wallow in energy poverty. And because they are too poor to buy energy, they are condemned to perpetual poverty because there is no society that has broken from the poverty or underdevelopment cycle without making energy accessible and affordable to a vast majority of its people. The other possible reason is that having gotten used to receiving dollars from oil and gas exports, with which we satisfy the conspicuous lifestyles of our elites, we have found it difficult to prioritize energy access to a vast majority of our people over other peoples. Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, APO is today focused on creating an integrated regional and continental energy markets. To create energy markets, we need to first create adequate national, cross-border, regional, and interregional energy infrastructure, pipelines, depots, storage facilities, terminals, etc. This is where non-oil and gas-producing countries come in. They participate as transit countries or facilitators for energy market integration. In doing so, they also benefit from the energy that passes through their countries, tapping from it to energize their national economies and lift their people from poverty. In this respect, I would like to say that one of the projects we are currently working on in partnership with the Central Africa Business Energy Forum, CABEF, is the Central Africa Pipeline System, CAPS. It's a comprehensive pipeline system that aims to link 11 Central African states by crude oil, products, and gas pipelines.
And I just want to start with these off-the-cuff questions. And I'm sorry you had to bring your friends to talk to us today, but we welcome them. When you make that decision in your boardroom, and I want you to take us through that journey to make an investment in an African country, and where to put the company's money or your money, how do you make that decision and what goes through your board and in order to make and choose, pick, and where to invest in Africa?
Yeah, the conversation, NJ, is fundamentally the conversation I'm having with my shareholders who provide the capital that we invest, and with our banks and bondholders who provide the debt that we also invest. But at its core, there's strong support for a just energy transition. It's at the core of Kosmos' strategy. You know, I'm pleased that we're here to talk about that today and enabling the finance to support that agenda. So at its core, it's about the clarity of strategy, a strategy that's supported by our shareholders and debt holders. And then ultimately, it's about how do you pick the best projects. And, you know, our backers want to see projects in countries where there's stability of the fiscal regimes, where there's clarity of purpose. And the clarity of purpose is about a project that aligns with the country's agenda, that therefore is sustainable for the long term because it serves the purpose. It creates that economic development. And so purpose is important, and alignment of purpose creates mutuality. And finally, it's about regulation that's predictable. You can get things done. You talked about sign, but to sign, you have to have a process which is predictable. You put those three things together, and that's ultimately where the money's going to go. And within Africa, ultimately, the countries that are going to get differential support are ones where the money is welcome. So I think those are the three factors that influence decision-making, but ultimately, it's about a strategy where a just energy transition is being supported and being supported by our shareholders and debt holders.
What does a just energy transition mean for you and your shareholders?
A just energy transition ultimately is about addressing the issues that Africa faces today. You know, we talk about a deep gas resource in Africa. We'll debate that, I'm sure, over the next 3 days as to how you ensure that it's used and how it's used for Africa for its energy needs. Yeah. You know, I find it quite curious that some of the Western leaders today are advocating for Africa to prioritize renewables. For me, I have a vision of the Western countries having gone up the up escalator of hydrocarbon resource development, got to the top, switched the escalator off, and said to Africa, now you come up the stairs. Yeah. Coming up the stairs is not going to address the 600 million who don't have power today, the 900 million that don't have access to clean cooking fuels. So how do you put that at the center of a just energy transition? And it is possible. It is possible to attract the finance. It is possible to come up with innovative development schemes that enable Africa to use its gas for its needs.
But I want to stick on this trend. You have greenlight a lot of projects in Africa. Mm-hmm. But to the audience here, what is the biggest challenge you face when trying to get a project off the ground, trying to get a project started, be it a gas project or an oil project or heck, a renewable project?
You know, it's back to the point about the predictability of regulation. There are typically 4 constituencies involved. You know, there's the work with the NOCs where you have to agree around the concept. You've got something that's economic, that's efficient, that's low cost, delivers the margin that all the parties needs. The second constituency is the Ministry of Energy, which is looking to ensure that it meets the regulations within the country and is fulfilling all of those requirements. The Ministry of the Environment also has a say in terms of the sustainability of the project. And then ultimately, the Ministry of Finance, you know, does it actually deliver the economic outcome? I think it's tough at times, NJ, to ensure that you create alignment amongst those parties. You have to work very hard to make sure that there is alignment. And I think the challenge that sometimes people don't understand is if you're doing really well, you can get from discovery to FID, you know, 4 years, maybe 5 years. The typical political cycle is 4 or 5 years. And so the change of government within that cycle also causes potentially delay. Delay creates inefficiency, delay creates higher cost, and delay ultimately, therefore, creates poorer projects. And I think it's creating predictability around, you know, those 4 elements that ultimately is, you know, the toughest thing.
And, you know, we're running out of time, but I want to just let you close with this last question. When you look at this continent, its investors, and the host communities. Where do you see Africa's energy future? You're reflecting on so many years in investing, but also working in the continent. Where do you see it going?
Look, the thing that I'm most excited about is the gas resource in Africa. Africa has the right to become a gas powerhouse, competing with an Australia, a Qatar, a US. It has the resources to do it. It can emulate the US by ensuring that that gas is being used domestically. The US has the lowest price, domestic price of gas of any continent, any country in the world. It underpins its economic growth. That's what Africa can do. And it will do it by ensuring it's used domestically. It creates affordable power. Ultimately, it addresses the 600 million that don't have access to power today. And that number's only going to get larger as Africa's population grows. So that's the agenda. We need to think big. We need to think beyond single countries and single developments. We need to think about the cross-border opportunities that we have. We need to think about the infrastructure that's required to ensure that it benefits Africa and it's not a fuel simply for export.
Thank you, sir, and thank you to Cosmos for all that you're doing.
Thank you.
Thank you.
This conference is of great importance because it gives us the opportunity as Africans to evaluate ourselves and especially our endeavors to ensure that we build an oil and gas industry that is beneficial to our countries as well as one that provides energy security to our people. Our priority must continue to be to end energy poverty for all Africans, as well as create an enabling environment where the oil and gas industry can thrive, be beneficial for local content, as well as be responsible with the environment. That, ladies and gentlemen, is our priority in Angola, and we look forward to working with brotherly nations as well as all of you here to keep it that way. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, Angola has been on a reform path since His Excellency João Manuel Gonçalves Lourenço, President of the Republic of Angola, became President in 2017. These reforms in the oil and gas sector have one goal, and that is to be globally competitive by creating the best possible enabling environment for the oil and gas sector in Angola. We believe that a healthy oil and gas sector in Angola is good for sustainable socioeconomic development as well as for the global energy security. The Angolan government has been working tirelessly to establish an attractive and globally competitive regulatory environment, establishing market-oriented policies and tax regimes. In this regard, efforts have been primarily directed towards the growth of the oil industry, but with the ultimate goal of creating wealth and prosperity for every Angolan. To address the challenges identified at the beginning of the first mandate, the government redefined the governance model of the oil sector, creating entities to focus specific objectives such as concessionaire, regulation, inspection, and operation. As such, the National Oil, Gas and Biofuels Agency was created as the national concessionaire responsible for regulating, promoting, and supervising the execution of petroleum activities in the upstream segment. We also create the Petroleum Derivatives Regulatory Institute, which deals with the regulation supervision in the midstream and downstream segments. In parallel with the creation of the above-mentioned institution, our national oil company, Sonangol, was given the role of a public company focused on its main corporate purpose, which encompasses the entire value chain of the oil industry, namely prospecting, reserves, production, refining, transportation, storage, distribution and marketing of oil, natural gas, and derivative products. to our national oil company was given also the task to become an energy company. This new governance model has brought greater transparency and competitiveness to the sector, making it more attractive for attracting national and foreign investments, which have allowed, despite adversities such as the COVID-19 pandemic, to maintain national oil production above 1 million barrels per day over the last 5 years. To ensure that Angolan oil production remains above 1 million barrels of oil per day over the coming years, the government has put in place certain measures as follows. The bidding strategy for new oil concessions for the period 2019-2025, which aims to award at least 50 new blocks, with more than 32 blocks having been awarded to date. The hydrocarbon exploration strategy for the period 2020 to 2025, which aims to boost and intensify the replenishment of reserves. The permanent offer regime for oil blocks that allows the permanent promotion and negotiation of unawarded auctioned blocks, free areas in concession blocks, and concession assigned to the national concession. Shortly, we approved again a new instrument called incremental production that gives incentives for the companies to produce above the commitments. The above-mentioned important measures taken by the Angolan executive during our first mandate are now having a positive effect with the implementation of projects that will contribute to the stabilization of oil production in short and medium term. Meanwhile, some measures will have a longer-term effect, just as the development of the Caminho project by Total Energies and its partners, and activities in the New Frontier, the Namib Basin, down the south of Angola, where ExxonMobil is executing its first exploration well. We remind all the participants that we have a team from the Angolan upstream regulator here at the conference with a specific stand. So, if you are interested in investing in Angola, you are most then welcome to speak to them. As for the mid and downstream segments, the Angolan government has defined and is implementing a refining strategy and a program to improve the distribution of petroleum products, which includes increasing onshore storage capacity and building filling stations in all the country. The refining strategy includes the expansion of the Luanda refinery with installation of a new catalytic reforming unit, already completed, with the aim to increase gasoline production, and the construction of 3 new refineries, being one in Cabinda with a processing capacity of 60,000 barrels per day, another one in Soyo with a processing capacity of 100,000 barrels per day, and the third one in Lubito with a processing capacity of 200,000 barrels per day. The liberalization of the downstream segment in Angola has opened up space for more operators to enter the sector and invest in logistics, distribution, and marketing activities of refined products. All these developments are being pursued with the aim of not just providing the products for Angola. We look forward to working together with our neighbors in the implementation of cross-border solutions that will be a win-win solution for all our countries, and we call on investors to come and work together with us.
As African leaders, industry experts, and capital providers gather here to discuss pressing issues in the energy sector, many of which we've already heard about, there is one topic that really looms large, and that is the need to scale up investment in the continent's energy systems. So I'd like to start out by highlighting some data points that demonstrate really the scale and the urgency of the investment and financing requirements. African countries account for almost 20% of the global population, but only for 4% of the world's total energy investment. Now, this imbalance should be ringing an alarm bell for all of us, not just within African countries, which are seeking rightly to attract more investment, but also at the global level, as it risks perpetuating broader imbalances. Secondly, energy investment on the continent has been falling over the past decade, and our tracking suggests that around $110 billion is set to be invested in Africa in 2024. This is far below our estimated $200 billion in annual needs for the continent to achieve all of its energy and climate-related goals by 2030. And of course, the high cost of capital is a major barrier to scaling up investment. According to our data, it can be up to 2 or 3 times higher in Africa than in North America or Europe. And this raises the bankability bar and makes projects more difficult to finance. So lowering the cost of capital to make available affordable finance is really critical for the step change that is needed for Africa to meet its energy and climate-related goals. Now let me highlight 2 areas which the International Energy Agency sees as particularly critical. The first, as has been mentioned, is energy access. Despite progress, we're still far from achieving universal energy access. 600 million people in Africa, roughly 40% of the population, still lack access to electricity, and nearly 1 billion people, some 70% of the population, lack access to clean cooking fuels. The implications of this are vast, not just in terms of the limits it places on education and economic opportunities, but also the health implications. Globally, a lack of clean cooking contributes to 3.7 million premature deaths per year, disproportionately affecting women and children. And according to our analysis, achieving the SDG 7 goals of universal access will require around $30 billion annually between now and 2030, covering both electricity and clean cooking. Now, this is a relatively small number in the global energy investment landscape, about just 1% of total energy investment. But this masks the scale and complexity of the challenge. Investment in electricity access and clean cooking has historically been below $5 billion annually, and affordability concerns make this a particularly difficult area to finance. Additional efforts are therefore needed, anchored in public and concessional finance to achieve universal access. And the second key area is driving investment towards an energy sector geared for industrialization. Many countries across Africa have set their vision on seizing opportunities for renewable energy deployment to leverage industrial development and socioeconomic advancement. And this is a key theme for the IEA, and one that I'll be very pleased to also discuss this afternoon during the launch of the IEA's new report, Renewable Energy Opportunities for Namibia, together with the Minister of Mines and Energy of Namibia, Honorable Tom Alwendo. But Africa's industrialization also relies in part on natural gas, as I had the opportunity to mention here 2 years ago when we had just launched our Africa Energy Outlook special report. And in that report, we modeled a pathway that saw the continent achieve all of its energy and climate-related goals by 2030. Now, to meet Africa's growing energy needs, natural gas use increases, mostly to meet industrial demand for high and medium heat applications. And the use of these gas resources over the next 30 years would bring Africa's share of cumulative global emissions to a mere 3.5%, from today's mark of 3%. Now, the impact of these additional emissions would be minimal on a global scale, but the developmental impact, we acknowledge, would be very significant for African countries endowed with such resources. So I'd just like to conclude by really underscoring Africa is clearly a vital continent with significant opportunities, home to more than half of the world's best solar resources, but also hydro, wind, geothermal, and natural gas. Africa's abundant energy resources can pave the way for a brighter future for all Africans.
My talk today is going to focus on transforming Africa's oil and gas landscape through strategic mergers and acquisitions. And I think the organizers of the conference chose this topic because as an indigenous player, we've been able to scale up and build a substantial company using this approach in our upstream business. But I'll start by, first of all, talking about global themes. And in terms of global M&A in our industry, in today's world, it tends to be focused around gas, energy transition is the priority, decarbonization, and most of the oil companies, the big oil companies that is, are reviewing their portfolios. So in recent times, we've seen companies like BG being acquired by Shell, and other major deals have been done around that space. There's been a lot of consolidation as well, too, in the oil and gas, primarily around the North American area, where there's been a lot of focus regarding companies putting their assets together to create larger shale oil companies like Hess, sorry, escaped my mind. Anyway, those companies are there doing those transactions in that region. In terms of IOC, there's been IOC divestment and indigenous company growth around the African region, and in that region, we've seen divestments occur due to high-risk assets being considered areas being considered dangerous. For example, Libya, you've seen some divestments, Nigeria, and certain areas of sub-Saharan Africa. There's also been a focus on low-cost, high-return oil and gas assets with existing infrastructure and favorable regulatory concerns. Now, in terms of oil and gas landscape, it's changing as IOCs are divesting from the African assets. Between 2014 and 2024, there's been over $10 billion in divested assets in our region. Basically, as I mentioned earlier on, reduction in the carbon footprint has been a priority. Diversifying their portfolios from oil to accommodate major gas-producing fields has been an area of priority for them. And then also to generate more cash. For example, ExxonMobil has done a divestment from the Nigerian shallow water and has invested substantially in Guyana, which has seen quite a successful 1.2 million barrel ramp-up in that region. The rising security threats, which have created certain operational instability and increased personnel risk, that has been a big driver, and I already mentioned that before. So now what's going on is that there's a shift towards M&A activity on our continent. There's a focus on onshore and shallow water acquisitions, clearly because on the onshore, the assets exist, the infrastructure exists, and it's easier for indigenous companies to scale up because the reserve base on the continent is substantial. What is lacking has been the continual investment to see development grow on the continent. It's been focused entirely by the majors coming in, having good discoveries, focusing on the export, and with very little going on in terms of domestic infrastructural development for the industry. And I think the point was made earlier on regarding how the US has the cheapest source of gas in the world, which underpins the economy, and that's because of the local distribution which exists of gas products, which has underpinned their industrial development. There have been major transactions done in recent times. ExxonMobil and Seplat in Nigeria, a $1.2 billion deal that see them take on close to 500 million barrels of 2P reserves, as well as net production from that acquisition. Renaissance, which is a consortium of about 5 indigenous Nigerian oil and gas companies who had done well from the last round of activity, divestment, M&A divestment from Shell, have formed a consortium to do this transaction. They're right now at consent stage with the federal government of Nigeria. Total Energies have sold a 10% stake on their onshore asset to Chapal in Nigeria, and then GARP Energies have sold to Etu in Angola, which is a $443 million transaction. Eni to Apex, and then Tolo, Panora, and ExxonMobil's Chad Access were sold to Savannah, which is listed in the UK, but I mean, it's primarily an African independent for $670 million. Finally, there was Shell's assets, Sala Energy. I think that was a secondary deal done for $620 million. Now, in terms of what these divestments have done, they've ushered in a new area of opportunity, positioning M&A as a crucial driver for the transformation of Africa's energy landscape. I say this because with the reserve base, what countries have suffered from on the continent is a sudden ramp up, like you've seen Nigeria average at 2.5 million barrels per day, but drop to 1.3 million barrels of oil production. By the time you add the condensates, we're probably around the 1.7 million barrel mark. But the reality is that, and Angola, for example, has seen a ramp up and a drop. I feel what the indigenous companies could achieve is a stabilizing force in terms of maintaining that production. In Nigeria, for example, 70% of the majors' production on the onshore came from 30% of their acreage. And it took time for the regulators to realize, well, they knew this was going on, but to encourage those oil companies to consider divestment as an approach and to also ensure that the local population had the capacity, the willingness, and the intention to be able to develop these resources. Effectively, indigenous companies attract strategic investors. We've been able to diversify our energy portfolios. We were a downstream company, and by these opportunities, we were able to transit from being a downstream company distributing fuels, distributing gas, into a substantial upstream player within our local environment. We've been able to foster local content and employment, over 3,000 employees, and increase investment in regional infrastructure. We have cross-border investments in other African countries. Basically, in terms of sizes, I think indigenous companies are poised to lead Africa's oil and gas sector. Clearly, we know that the majors there's a big focus towards natural gas, as you would see, but Africa still has a substantial amount of oil that is available, and the oil world will still consume oil for the considerable future. And it's up to the indigenous companies to take advantage of this hiatus and make moves towards being able to develop this. There will be diversification into gas and renewables. Indigenous companies are already doing most of this as well too. We have probably 60% of Nigeria's energy needs will be done by local distribution of gas products. It's being done by indigenous companies. And gradually, as we get hold of reserves, you would see African indigenous players like us getting involved in the LNG. For example, we as a company are the second largest suppliers of gas to the Nigerian LNG after Shell in today's market, our joint venture with the NNPC.
It is an honor to address you today at Africa Energy Week, an occasion that brings us together, that brings together leaders, experts, and advocates dedicated to a common purpose, empowering Africa to take control and harness our energy future. As Kwame Nkrumah envisioned, Africa's journey is not merely about emulating paths set by others, but about building an African vision that recognizes energy security as a foundation for our collective growth and shared prosperity. Energy is not just a commodity. It is a keystone for development. The political economy of energy shapes every dimension of life on our continent, from social progress and economic growth to industrialization and job creation. The availability, accessibility, affordability, and sustainability of the energy landscape must be defined as part of our capacity to address poverty, inequality, and underdevelopment. Today, Africa faces the complex challenge of transforming its energy systems while safeguarding the principles enshrined in Africa 2063 agenda, a blueprint that envisaged an integrated, prosperous, and peaceful Africa driven by inclusive growth and sustainable development. Energy is critical to realizing each of the 7 aspirations outlined in Africa 2063 agenda, but 2 are especially relevant to our work here today. The first one, Aspiration 1, namely a prosperous Africa based on inclusive growth and sustainable development. The second one, Aspiration 6, an Africa whose development is people-driven, relying on the potential offered by African people, especially its women and youth. Achieving these aspirations requires us to rethink our energy policies and investment frameworks through a developmental lens. Africa has been resource-rich, yet power-poor for far too long, with our vast reserves of minerals, oil, gas, and renewables untapped or under-leveraged. Addressing this disconnect requires structural reforms and substantial investments to build resilient, inclusive energy systems that empower African communities and industries. The challenge of energy access is not simply about expanding supply. It is fundamentally about ensuring that energy becomes a transformative asset for all Africans. Energy poverty remains widespread, and approximately 600 million Africans lack access to electricity. This deprivation hinders economic participation, affects health outcomes, and limits the educational opportunities, especially for women and youth in rural areas. By tackling energy poverty, we do not merely light homes and power businesses, we lay the groundwork for an equitable society where opportunity is within reach of every citizen. The question before us is how to accelerate energy security whilst addressing structural inequalities. Africa has the potential to lead the world in renewable energy and innovative energy solutions. But our path to energy transformation must reflect the values of equity and inclusiveness at the heart of Agenda 2063 vision. As we engage in this critical week of discussions and partnerships, let us remain committed to building energy systems that respect our environment, create dignified jobs, and fuel African industries, safeguarding our independence and self-determination. Africa's potential for renewable energy is unmatched globally. The continent is rich in diverse renewable resources, each offering a path towards sustainable growth that is dependent on fossil fuels and more aligned with global climate commitments. These renewable sources include solar energy, with vast stretches of land bathed in sunlight year-round. Africa has some of the highest solar irradiation levels in the world, especially across the regions of the Sahara and sub-Saharan Africa. Solar energy has the potential to power communities, businesses, and industrial zones especially in off-grid and rural areas. Wind energy, from the coastal winds of Egypt to the strong inland gusts in Kenya and Ethiopia. Africa's wind corridors hold immense potential for generating clean electricity. Expanding wind energy capacity offers not only a path to sustainability, but also an opportunity for job creation in turbine manufacturing and maintenance. Hydropower. Africa has significant untapped potential, especially in countries with major rivers such as the Congo, Nile, and Zambezi. Hydropower projects, when sustainably managed, can provide baseload power to support industrialization and rural electrification, helping reduce energy costs for industries. I should pause here to say South Africa and the DRC are currently party to a binational commission. The binational commission seeks to drive the necessary investments to unlock the potential of the Great Congo River to support energy production.
Gathered here today are some of the most important people required for shaping that future. It is therefore important that we seize the opportunity offered by the platform to collectively define the energy agenda we want for our continent. It is my hope that my remarks today will contribute to that objective. Your Excellencies, distinguished ladies and gentlemen, Africa is blessed with immense natural resources, as we've heard from various previous speakers this morning. It hosts nearly 10% of the world's oil reserves and over 7% of its natural gas reserves. Additionally, our continent boasts 40% of global solar energy potential, translating to nearly 60 million terawatt-hours per year. Yet, even as these resources shape Africa's promise, they also reveal a challenging contradiction. Despite our wealth in mineral resources, nearly 600 million Africans lack access to electricity, and that is about 80% of the population of the world that lack access to electricity, that we find them here on the continent. While many others rely on inefficient traditional means of energy. This is the paradox of poverty in the midst of plenty. The energy deficit across the continent hampers economic and human development and undermines social progress by affecting the basic needs of millions of Africans. The World Bank estimates that inadequate access to reliable energy reduces Africa's annual GDP growth rate by between 2% and 4%, a formidable barrier to the continent's economic progress. For our industries, hospitals, educational institutions, energy is not a mere commodity, but a lifeline. That's why we can no longer afford to be bound by outdated and mostly colonial structures that prevent us from unlocking these resources. The need to address this deficit has never been more urgent. And beyond energy security, we have failed to realize the full benefits of oil and gas resources beneath our soils and oceans. We won God's lottery that showered Africa with abundant energy resources, but have little or nothing to show for it. The starting point for addressing this energy problem is clearly to significantly raise investment in this sector in Africa. Despite the continent's immense resources, as mentioned earlier, and the fact that it accounts for nearly 20% of global population, it attracts only about 3% of the global spending on energy. According to the recent report from the International Energy Agency, which the representative also read here, annual investments in the African energy sector need to more than double to over $240 billion by 2030 in order to meet the continent's rising energy requirements, as well as to improve access to energy and achieve the climate and development goals set by governments in the region. The challenge is not just that the investments are grossly inadequate, but also that the investments have been on a steady decline since they peaked in 2014. A decline largely driven by a reduction in funding for fossil fuels by many international banks. It is important to point out that our aspirations for African energy sector will remain aspirations unless we are able to reverse the trend by unlocking significant funding, mostly from within our continent. They will remain mere aspirations unless we take full control of our energy resources and extract the maximum value therefrom, or through their value chains. My dear brothers and sisters, it is high time we took concrete steps to reverse the course of inaction that has made us the laughingstock of the world. At Afreximbank, we had since identified two critical steps that must be taken. First, we must not wait for others to finance our development, of which the energy sector is key. African institutions must lead the way. For instance, as foreign international banks pulled back from financing Africa's energy sector, Afreximbank has increased its financing, having disbursed over $34 billion to the sector in the last few years. Second, instead of reveling in the misguided euphoria of being major crude oil exporters, we must now work to turn the continent into a massive refining hub and use that to also build a solid petrochemical industrial base to boost Africa's manufacturing, create jobs, raise GDP, and export revenues. And because Afreximbank believes in doing what it preaches, it has started taking important steps in these two directions.